Hi, welcome to our daily encounter. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10, Paul speaks about the experience of the Israelites in the wilderness. He says, "For I do not want you to be unaware, brethren, that our fathers were all under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they were drinking from a spiritual rock which would follow them, and the rock was Christ. Nevertheless, with most of them God was not well pleased, for they were laid low in the wilderness." Now listen to this, verse 6. "Now these things happened as examples for us, so that we would not crave evil things as they also craved." These Israelites in the wilderness had experienced some wonderful things. They saw the sea part, they saw water come out of the rock, and yet even though they had these great experiences of God's power, with many of them, he says, God was not well pleased. And he said that these things happened so that we would have an example of what not to do, that we would not crave after evil things as they did. And this is the same spirit in which Asaph writes Psalm 78. Psalm 78 is a rather lengthy psalm, but Asaph goes and looks at the history of Israel as a nation. And it starts out by considering the generations to come, the children yet to be born. In verse 5 he says, "For he established a testimony in Jacob, and appointed a law in Israel, which he commanded our fathers that they should teach them to their children, that the generation to come might know, even the children yet to be born, that they may arise and tell them to their children, that they should put their confidence in God, and not forget the works of God, and keep his commandments, and not be like their fathers, a stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation that did not prepare its heart, and whose spirit was not faithful to God." And that is a concise yet all-inclusive introduction to what he would go on to say as he goes through Israel's history and how they had rebelled so often against God. But he wanted the children to know the commandments of the Lord, and to know what the Lord had done, the works of the Lord, and to know to not be like their fathers, the stubborn and rebellious generation. It's interesting how seamless the thought of Psalm 77 and 78 is. How it transitions beautifully. Remember in Psalm 77, in our devotion yesterday, we saw how Asaph used remembering God and God's works to comfort him in his distress, in his trials. And this was kind of on an individual basis. We as individuals, we need to remember the works of God, whether it's the works of God in our own lives, or the works of God that we read about in scriptures. We could even add the works of God that are in other people's lives that can bring us encouragement. But it's more individual. Psalm 78 seems to be more geared towards a whole generation of people, perhaps even a whole nation, as he talks about children yet to be born. He's talking about like future generations. And they also needed to remember, as we as individuals need to remember, we also as a people, as a collective group, need to remember history. History is so important and so vital to helping us in the present. If you think about it, as you as an individual, what is one of the main ways that you learn? Isn't it by trial and error? Learning from your mistakes, as we say it? You do. A lot of the things that you know today, the wisdom that you have gathered over the years, is based upon learning from mistakes that you have made. And not just learning from mistakes you made, but also learning from things that you did that worked out well for you. And you remember that, and hopefully you try to repeat those things. So remembering your own individual history is important, but it's also important to understand your history, whether you're talking about a nation. We as citizens of the United States, we should be familiar with the history of the United States, because it can help us in making decisions today when we can understand where we came from, the mistakes that we've made in the past, the things that we've done that was actually good, so that we can encourage those things. It's good to know history, and it's good to know history from a spiritual perspective as well. To look back on human history and look at it through God's eyes. Look through it from a spiritual perspective, and learn from those things. Learn about the worst of human history, and the dark times in human history, and learn how to avoid those things as a people. What can we do to not allow ourselves to go down that path again? To look back at church history, and it too is littered with several dark places that we don't want to repeat, and things that people did that were wrong that should be avoided, and things that people did right that should be followed, that should be exemplified. But it's very, very important to know history. If we as an individual can learn from our past mistakes and successes, then we as a people, as a group, whether you're talking about the church or a nation or whatever group you're talking about, you can do the same thing. Learn the same things. It can be an encouragement to us. It can stir in our hearts a desire, a passion, not to do the bad that we've seen. You can think about perhaps maybe you might have some bad examples in your own life. He's talking about that they should not be like their fathers. And I know he's talking about several generations back, perhaps, but we could look at perhaps our fathers, by fathers just mean past generations, and maybe we come from a very dark past. Maybe we have a family history of sin, of maybe alcoholism, a lot of other things, drug addiction. Some people come to Christ who have come from some very difficult places, and we shouldn't let that past get us down and cause us to be ashamed of our past, but use that as motivation and say, you know what, I'm not going to follow in the paths of the past generations before me. I'm going to pave my own path, a new path. I'm going to allow God to direct me in another way. And to do exactly what Asaph is encouraging that these future generations ought to do, to look back and say, no, I'm not going to be like that. I am going to walk in the ways of the Lord. So let's never neglect history. You don't have to be a history buff. You don't have to know, the exact years of the Civil War, or the exact year that Napoleon conquered and did all the great things that he did. But we should have a general knowledge of history, and at least enough to where we can learn what to exemplify in our lives and what not to, and what to follow as a people and what not to follow. So these are just some things to think about. I hope you guys have a great day today. Love you guys. God bless.